Lower that hammer and you will regret it by morning." The words cut through the roar of the auction crowd like a blade through dry rope, and every man, woman, and child gathered in the sun-baked yard of Caldwell, Kansas fell utterly silent. Emma Hawthorne stood on the wooden platform with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in the tips of her fingers where they gripped the rough railing beside her. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Clyde Perkins, who had done business in this town for 15 years without a single soul challenging him, froze with his wooden gavel suspended 6 inches above the block. His eyes traveled across the crowd and found the man who had spoken. Joel Hartwell stood at the back of the gathered throng like a storm that had wandered in off the open plains and decided to stay. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that came from real labor and not vanity, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that held something dangerous and something deeply, furiously honest all at once. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his jaw was set in a line that every rancher in Caldwell County recognized as the line a man drew before he stopped talking and started acting. Emma did not know this man. She had arrived in Caldwell 3 days ago on the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, a carpetbag in one hand and a folded contract in the other, and everything since then had moved like a nightmare she could not wake from. She had been promised employment as a housekeeper for a ranching family named Howell. She had been promised a modest wage and a safe room of her own. Instead, Howard Briggs, the man who had orchestrated her journey west from St. Louis, had turned out to be a fraud and a schemer of the very worst sort, and now Emma stood on an auction platform in front of 200 strangers, while Briggs sat fat and satisfied in the front row waiting to collect whatever sum her domestic labor could command over the next 12 months. It was not slavery. Everyone gathered here today would have been deeply offended if you called it that. But Emma Hawthorne knew the difference between a contract and a cage was often only a matter of paperwork. She searched the crowd for any face she recognized and found none. Then she found Joel Hartwell's face, and something in the fearless certainty she saw there made her hold very, very still. Clyde Perkins cleared his throat. "Sir, this is a legal labor auction conducted under the jurisdiction of—" "I know what jurisdiction it is," Joel said, and he was already moving through the crowd, which parted for him without his having to ask. "And I know what it looks like from where I'm standing. That woman did not come to Caldwell to be sold at public auction like a side of beef. She came here under false pretenses and a forged contract, and I will swear to that in front of Judge Alderman himself before sundown if I have to." Howard Briggs rose from his chair in the front row. He was a thick man with a pink, self-satisfied face and small eyes that moved too quickly. "Hartwell, this is none of your affair. The woman signed the terms herself." "She signed terms that were misrepresented to her," Joel said. He had reached the edge of the platform now, and he looked up at Emma directly for the first time. Something passed between them that neither of them could have named yet, something electric and uncertain and sharp as a splinter, and Emma found that she could breathe again in a way she had not been able to for 3 days. "Did you sign a contract for private domestic employment with the Howell family, ma'am?" Emma's voice, when it came out, was steadier than she expected. "I signed a contract for private domestic employment with a family in Caldwell County, not for public auction." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Briggs stabbed a thick finger in Joel's direction. "You have no legal standing here, Hartwell. You want her services so bad you can bid like everyone else." Joel's expression did not change. He looked at Briggs for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was very quiet, which made it carry further than if he had shouted. "Howard Briggs, I have known you for 7 years, and in that time you have cheated 3 homesteaders out of their land, swindled a widow in Wichita, and now you have brought an innocent woman 400 miles from her home on a lie. I am telling you now, in front of every person in this yard, lower that hammer and you will regret it by morning. Because by morning I will have ridden to Judge Alderman's ranch. I will have that fraudulent contract in my hand, and I will have the full force of what law exists in this county coming down on your head like a rock slide." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Clyde Perkins set his gavel down on the block very, very slowly. He looked at Briggs. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the fact that nearly 200 people had just heard Joel Hartwell make a direct and specific accusation that would be very difficult to walk back from. "I think," Perkins said carefully, "we may need to pause proceedings pending a review of the contract documentation." Briggs turned an extraordinary color of red. "You cannot do that. I have buyers who have traveled." "The auction is paused," Perkins said, with more backbone than anyone had expected from him, and Emma later thought it was purely because the man had correctly read which way the wind was blowing in this particular crowd, and the wind was blowing entirely in Joel Hartwell's direction. That was how it began. Emma had not always been the kind of woman who found herself standing on auction platforms in Kansas. She had grown up in St. Louis, the eldest daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, and she had received a better education than most women of her time and class because her father believed firmly that an educated daughter was more valuable than a decorative one. He had been dead for 4 years now, and her mother for 3, and Emma had spent the years since then doing what sensible, educated, resourceful young women without family money did in the year 1879, which was work. She had been a schoolteacher herself for 2 years in a respectable neighborhood on the south side of St. Louis. She had been a bookkeeper's assistant for a dry goods merchant for 8 months after the school closed due to a funding dispute that had nothing to do with her. She had been a seamstress, a laundress, a reader for an elderly widow with failing eyesight, and finally, when the last of these positions had ended and she was 24 years old with a carpetbag full of worn clothes and a skill set that was considerable but did not translate easily into steady income, she had answered an advertisement in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The advertisement had been specific and had seemed legitimate. It had described a ranching family in Caldwell, Kansas, seeking a housekeeper and occasional tutor for 2 young children. It had promised room, board, and a wage of $12 a month, which was more than Emma had been earning in St. Louis. It had been signed by one Howard Briggs, described as a labor agent working on behalf of the Howell family. Emma had written, received a prompt and thoroughly professional-sounding reply, and had eventually signed a contract that she had read carefully, line by line, and that it appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be. What the contract had not mentioned, tucked into the subordinate clauses she had studied so carefully, was a provision she had not encountered in any previous employment agreement and had therefore not known to look for. A provision that allowed Briggs, as the intermediary labor agent, to conduct a public auction of her services to the highest bidder in the event that the original employer withdrew from the arrangement. And the Howell family, she had discovered upon arriving in Caldwell, did not exist. Briggs had been very smooth about it. He had met her at the station with apologies and a plausible story about the Howell family having relocated unexpectedly to Denver. And Emma, exhausted and disoriented after 2 days on a train, had not immediately identified the trap she was in. She had been installed in a boarding house room, told that Briggs would make alternative arrangements, and had only understood the full shape of her situation when she overheard 2 men talking in the hallway outside her room that evening. She had spent 2 days trying to find a way out that did not require money she did not have or legal assistance that was not available to a woman alone in a strange town. She had gone to the sheriff's office, where a deputy had told her the contract appeared to be legally binding and there was nothing he could do. She had gone to the dry goods store and the bank and the post office asking if anyone knew of employment, and everywhere she had been met with either disinterest or a knowing look that told her Briggs had already worked to isolate her. She had written 2 letters, one to a former employer in St. Louis and one to a cousin in Chicago, but there had been no time for either letter to receive a reply before the day of the auction arrived. And then she had stood on that platform under the hot Kansas sun and listened to the bids rise, and everything inside her had gone very quiet and very cold, and she had thought quite clearly, this is not who I am, and this is not where my life ends. And she had been looking for any crack of light in the wall around her when Joel Hartwell's voice had split the morning open. The hours after the auction suspension were a whirlwind of exactly the kind of activity Emma had been trying to set in motion for 2 days without success. Joel moved with a focus and a knowledge of the local machinery that she could only marvel at. He knew Judge Alderman personally, it turned out, because Judge Alderman's ranch shared a boundary with the Hartwell spread on the western edge of Caldwell County, and he knew the judge's habits and the fastest route to his ranch, and the specific legal arguments that would resonate with a man of Alderman's particular temperament. He also knew, because he had made it his business to know everything that happened in Caldwell County for the past 15 years, that Howard Briggs had used the same fraudulent labor contract scheme on at least 2 other women in the previous 18 months, both of whom had been too frightened or too isolated to fight back effectively. This was information that Judge Alderman received with a great deal of interest. Emma was not present for the meeting with the judge. She waited in the cool interior of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, which was a different and much more respectable establishment than the one Briggs had placed her in, because Joel had quietly arranged her move there before riding out. He had left her in the care of Mrs. Caldwell herself, a forthright widow of approximately 50 who brought Emma tea and corn bread, and a directness that Emma found enormously comforting after 2 days of people talking around her and over her. "Joel Hartwell is a good man, Mrs. Caldwell said, in a tone that suggested she was offering Emma useful information and not merely making conversation. "He can be hard to read. He does not say more than he means to say, and sometimes he says less, and people who don't know him mistake that for coldness. It isn't coldness. He is the most honest person in this county, which is sometimes its own kind of problem." "What kind of problem?" Emma asked. Mrs. Caldwell smiled slightly. "The kind where honest people do not always get along easily with a world that runs on convenient untruths." Joel returned in the early evening with Howard Briggs's fraudulent contract in his possession, a written order from Judge Alderman voiding Emma's obligations under it, and the news that a warrant had been issued for Briggs's arrest on charges of fraud and obtaining money under false pretenses. Briggs had attempted to leave town that afternoon and had been stopped at the Caldwell city limits by the sheriff, who had apparently found his civic duty considerably easier to locate once a sitting judge had weighed in on the matter. Emma received this news sitting at Mrs. Caldwell's kitchen table, and she pressed her lips together very hard for a moment before she could trust her voice. "Thank you," she said, when Joel came and sat across from her and slid the invalidated contract across the table. "I do not know how to properly express what your intervention today meant." Joel looked at the table rather than at her, turning his hat in his hands in a way she would come to know as something he did when he was working through what he wanted to say. "I have been watching Briggs operate in this county for a long time," he said. "You were not the first, and you would not have been the last if someone had not put a stop to it." "You said there were others," Emma said. "Other women he used this scheme on. 2 that I know of. Both came out here alone, same as you. Both were afraid to push back." He paused. "You were not afraid." "I was terrified," Emma said honestly. Something shifted in his expression. "You did not look terrified." "I am from St. Louis," Emma said. "We learn early that looking terrified only makes things worse." It surprised a quiet sound out of him that might have been a laugh, and Emma found that the tight band of anxiety that had been wrapped around her chest for 3 days loosened by precisely 1 degree. The immediate crisis was resolved, but Emma's situation remained genuinely complicated. She was in Caldwell, Kansas, with roughly $4.30 to her name, in a boarding house she could not afford to stay in beyond another 2 nights, in a town where she knew no one except Mrs. Caldwell, and the man who had rescued her from a fraudulent auction block. Her return train fare to St. Louis would cost more than she had. And even if she could get back to St. Louis, she would be returning to the same precarious situation that had led her to answer Briggs's advertisement in the first place. She did not share all of this with Joel that evening. She was not a woman who put her difficulties on display for people she had known for less than a day, regardless of how much she owed them. But Joel, it emerged, had already thought this through with the same methodical practicality he appeared to apply to most problems. "My housekeeper retired to live with her daughter in Topeka 6 weeks ago," he said, just as Emma was preparing to thank him again and take her leave for the evening. "I have been managing on my own since then, and it is becoming a problem. The Hartwell spread runs 4,000 head of cattle, and I have 8 men on the payroll, and the kind of cooking and keeping that requires is more than I can manage alongside everything else." Emma went very still. She could see where this was going, and she was not sure how she felt about it. "I am not offering charity," Joel said, which told her he had read her expression accurately. "I am offering an honest position for honest pay. $12 a month, room and board, same terms you signed for with Briggs. Real terms this time. You can read every line of any contract before you sign it and ask whatever questions you have, and I will answer them plainly." "May I think about it until morning?" Emma asked. "Of course," Joel said. She thought about it for approximately 45 minutes that evening and then stopped thinking about it, because every practical consideration pointed in the same direction, and she had learned from her father that extended deliberation on a point that was already decided was a waste of mental energy that could be better applied elsewhere. She accepted the position. The Hartwell spread was 12 miles outside of Caldwell, and Emma made the journey the following morning in Joel's wagon with her carpetbag in the back, and the Kansas landscape opening up around her in a way that was genuinely startling after years in a city. She had not understood before this how much sky there was in Kansas. It was everywhere, a vast and uninterrupted blue that went on until it became something other than sky, and the grasslands ran beneath it in long rolling waves of gold and pale green that made her feel both very small and inexplicably alive. Joel drove without speaking much, which she was learning was his default mode. He answered the questions she asked, and she had quite a few of them because she was a naturally curious person, and because she had always believed that asking good questions was a much more efficient way to understand a situation than waiting for information to be volunteered. He answered her with a directness and an absence of condescension that she appreciated enormously, because she had encountered a great deal of condescension in her interactions with men who believed that a woman asking about cattle operations or ranch finances was doing something vaguely inappropriate. He told her about the ranch. 4,000 head of longhorn cattle, a breed he had transitioned to from the original mixed herd his father had built because longhorns handled the Kansas summers better and moved more efficiently on the long drive south to the railheads. 8 hands, all men he had worked with for at least 2 years, with the exception of one young hand named Billy Crane who had come on 6 months ago and was showing himself to be reliable. A main house that was larger than she was perhaps expecting, he said, because his father had built it with ambitions that the family had never quite grown into filling. An orchard of 12 apple trees on the east side that had been his mother's project, and that he maintained out of something he did not name, but that Emma understood without needing it named. She learned that Joel was 31 years old and had been running the ranch alone for 3 years, since the death of his father, who had died of a fever in the winter of 1876. She learned that there had been a brother, 2 years younger, who had gone east to Kansas City with intentions that Joel summarized as trying to be something other than a cattleman, and did not elaborate on further, though his voice when he said it carried a complicated weight. She learned that the ranch had come close to financial disaster in the drought summer of 1878, and had survived it largely because Joel had made the decision to take his herd to market 3 weeks earlier than any other rancher in the county, and had gotten a price per head that would not have been available to him later in the season. He was not boasting when he told her this. He was giving her context, as though he had decided she deserved an honest picture of what she was arriving at and intended to provide it. Emma found this, in its own quiet way, almost unbearably refreshing. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise, and Emma's first impression was that it sat in the landscape as though it had grown there rather than been built, low and wide, and the color of the dry grass around it, with a long covered porch running the full length of the front. There were 2 red barns set back from the main house, and a corral with 6 horses in it, and a cook's building separate from the main house that she would learn was where meals for the hands were prepared, and apple trees just visible at the eastern corner, their leaves catching the morning light. She stepped down from the wagon and stood looking at it, and she thought, carefully and without sentimentality, that this was a place where things grew, where real, lasting things were built out of difficult country and honest labor. She did not let herself attach any significance to that thought beyond its face value. She had known this man for less than 24 hours. The first weeks at the Hartwell spread established themselves into a rhythm that Emma settled into with a speed that surprised her slightly, because she had always been a person who needed time to feel comfortable in a new place. The ranch kitchen was large and well-equipped by the standards of 1879 Kansas, with a cast iron range that had been ordered from a catalog and was the genuine pride of the ranch. And Emma, who had cooked in more difficult circumstances than this, found herself at home in it almost immediately. She cooked for Joel and for the 8 hands twice daily, a breakfast before dawn when the light was still gray and the air still cold, and a dinner at the end of the working day when everyone came in dusty and exhausted and hungry with a depth that city hunger never quite matched. She kept the house clean and the pantry stocked and the accounts organized, because the household accounts had been in a state of cheerful disorder since the previous housekeeper's departure that Joel was clearly relieved to have addressed. She found the previous housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Tanner, had been thorough and good-hearted, but had kept her records in a system that was largely personal and cryptic, and it took Emma most of a week to decode it and transpose it into something she could maintain and that anyone else could follow. Joel observed this process with what she initially interpreted as indifference and gradually recalibrated as something else. He noticed things. He did not always comment on them, but he noticed. She realized this in small increments, the way one realizes a season is changing, not in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of small evidence. He noticed when she was tired and quietly arranged for the hands' breakfast to be 30 minutes later on mornings after a long cattle drive had kept everyone working past midnight. He noticed when the east pasture fence had a gap she had mentioned only once, in passing, and had it repaired before the week was out. He noticed, and this was the one that stayed with her, that she went out to look at the apple trees on evenings when the light was particularly good, and one evening he came and stood beside her without comment, and they stood together in the amber light for a few minutes before going back inside, and it was one of the most comfortable silences she had ever experienced. She was not falling in love with him. She was not. She had been in Caldwell County for 3 weeks, and she was a sensible, educated woman of 24 who was not in the habit of letting gratitude and proximity corrupt her judgment. She was paying very close attention to him, though in the way she paid attention to everything that interested her, and he interested her enormously. The other hands had received her with a range of responses that settled, over the first 2 weeks, into a uniformly respectful dynamic that she attributed partly to the quality of her cooking, and partly to the fact that it was very clear, from the particular way Joel Hartwell did not watch her when other people were around, but was instantly and precisely aware of exactly where she was in any given space, that she was under his protection, and they would be ill-advised to forget it. She did not mention this to him. She thought he probably already knew she had noticed. Billy Crane, the youngest of the hands at 19, had an earnest, open quality that Emma warmed to, and he was the one who told her things about Joel that Joel would never have told her himself. Not out of indiscretion, but because Billy talked the way some young people do, in a stream of genuine and artless observation that was never intended to be revealing, and therefore revealed everything. "He bought a schoolhouse," Billy said one evening, while Emma was repacking the medicine kit and Billy had come to have a cut on his hand cleaned. "For the homesteaders' children, over in the east quarter of the county." Paid for it himself from the last cattle drive proceeds, and told the county board it was a private donation and didn't need his name on it, but everyone knows. Why did he do that? Emma asked, though she was beginning to suspect she could have answered the question herself. Billy shrugged. "He says an uneducated county is a poor county and a poor county can't sustain itself. He talks about it like it's just practical good sense. But I think he also just—" Billy paused, working through a thought that was slightly above his usual conversational altitude. "I think he just thinks it's the right thing to do. And he does the right thing even when it costs him something, which most people don't." Emma thought about this for a long time after Billy left. The difficulty arrived in the 5th week, in the form of a man named Garrison Ward, and it arrived with a kind of thoroughness and bad timing that Emma would later describe as entirely characteristic of the worst moments in life. Garrison Ward was a land broker operating out of Wichita, who had been attempting for the past 2 years to acquire the Hartwell spread for a consortium of Eastern investors, who wanted to consolidate small and mid-sized ranches into a single massive cattle operation. He had made 3 offers to Joel in those 2 years, each one larger than the last, and Joel had declined all 3 with the same level, unyielding courtesy he applied to most things he was certain about. Ward arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning when Joel was 3 days into a cattle drive south toward Wichita and was not expected back for another 4 days. Emma opened the door to a trim man of 40 in a good coat and a hat that cost more than most ranch hands made in a month, and she recognized the species immediately. She had encountered men like Garrison Ward in St. Louis, men who had cultivated the precise appearance of respectability because it was the most efficient tool available for getting what they wanted. Ward was smooth and professional and entirely courteous, and everything about him made the back of Emma's neck feel cold. He asked for Joel. Emma told him Joel was away on business. Ward expressed his regret and asked if he might leave a document for Joel to review on his return. Emma said of course, and Ward produced a manila envelope and handed it to her, and that was when his eyes moved around the kitchen in a way that was too thorough to be casual and landed on the account ledgers Emma had been working on at the kitchen table. "I see Mr. Hartwell has engaged a bookkeeper," Ward said. "A housekeeper," Emma said. "The accounts are part of the position." Ward smiled. "Of course. I wonder, since you have some familiarity with the ranch's financial picture, whether Mr. Hartwell has discussed with you the particular pressures facing mid-sized cattle operations in the current market." Emma looked at him steadily. "I think you should put anything you wish to communicate to Mr. Hartwell in writing," she said. "He will review it when he returns." Ward's smile did not waver, but something behind it did. "Very prudent," he said. He left, and Emma opened the manila envelope the moment his horse was out of sight, because she had a very strong feeling that what was inside it was something Joel needed to see before he saw Garrison Ward's carefully managed presentation of it, not after. The document was an offer, the 4th Ward had made, but it was constructed differently from the first 3. Emma knew this because she had organized Joel's files thoroughly enough by now to have read all 3 previous offers for context. This 4th offer was larger still, but it was structured with a deadline, a legal mechanism Emma recognized from her time as a bookkeeper's assistant, a mechanism that was designed to create artificial urgency, and that contained, in its subordinate clauses, terms that were substantially less favorable than the headline number suggested. She wrote 3 pages of notes on the document, line by line, flagging every provision that deserved scrutiny, and put them in an envelope on top of the kitchen table with Joel's name on it. He came back 2 days earlier than expected, because one of the younger steers had gone lame, and he had made the decision to sell early at a lower price, rather than push the animal and lose it entirely, which Emma by now recognized as entirely characteristic of his decision-making pattern. He read Ward's document and then read her notes, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening while she cooked, and the silence in the room had the particular quality of concentrated thought. "This provision here," he said, tapping her 3rd page of notes without looking up. "You identified that Ward's consortium could force a buyout of the water rights separately from the land acquisition." "On page 4 of the document," Emma said. "It's written in a way that makes it look like a standard limitation clause, but the effect, if you accepted the terms, would be that even if you ultimately declined to sell the land, they would have legal standing to purchase the water rights to the creek independently." Joel set the papers down. He looked across the kitchen at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something direct and undisguised and slightly complicated. "Where did you learn to read a contract like that?" "My father was a school teacher," Emma said. "He believed that understanding the precise meaning of written words was the most important practical skill a person could have. I worked for a year as an assistant to a commercial bookkeeper in St. Louis, and I learned the rest there." "Briggs did not deserve you," Joel said, and there was a heat in it, not anger exactly, but something adjacent to anger, something that had her name attached to it in a way that made her turn back to the stove and focus very carefully on what she was doing. "Briggs chose me specifically because I appeared to be alone and without resources," Emma said, keeping her voice even. "He underestimated several things." "He underestimated everything," Joel said. The evening went on, and dinner was served, and the hands came in and ate and told stories and argued about things with the comfortable low-level argumentativeness of men who worked closely together in difficult conditions. And Emma moved through the kitchen like she had been doing it for years and not for 5 weeks, and Joel sat at the head of the table and ate his dinner and spoke when spoken to and watched her when he thought she was not looking. She was always looking. She had excellent peripheral vision, and she had learned very early in life that the most important things people communicated. They communicated when they thought no one was paying attention. She lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the prairie wind work its way around the corners of the ranch house, and she thought about the fact that she had been brought to this place by fraud and desperation, and a man who had seen her standing on an auction block and decided, for reasons she was still not entirely sure she understood, that he was not going to allow what was happening to continue happening. She thought about the fact that she had been in this place for 5 weeks, and it felt more like home than anywhere she had lived since her parents died. She thought about Joel Hartwell sitting at the kitchen table reading her notes on Garrison Ward's document with an expression that had something in it she was not ready to name. She thought about all of this for a very long time, and then she made herself go to sleep, because she was a practical woman and she had an early breakfast to prepare. The conflict with Garrison Ward did not resolve itself with Joel's rejection of the 4th offer. Ward sent a 5th offer 2 weeks later, and when that was declined, he began a campaign of a more aggressive sort that revealed the hidden motive beneath his professional courteous surface. He began purchasing homestead claims surrounding the Hartwell spread on 3 sides, claims that were legally his to purchase, but that were being sold by families who were struggling after 2 difficult drought years, and who Ward was approaching with a combination of financial pressure and specific, planted information about the difficulties of maintaining a small claim in a region increasingly dominated by large cattle operations. Joel was methodical about responding to this. He organized a meeting of the neighboring homesteaders and smaller ranchers and laid out plainly what Ward was doing and what it meant if the surrounding land passed into the consortium's hands. He did not ask anyone to make decisions against their own financial interests. He provided information, and he provided it clearly, and then he worked with the county bank on a structure for short-term loans that would allow struggling families to hold their claims for another year while the market recovered. He put up part of the collateral for these loans himself, which was not a small thing for a ranch that was itself operating on a careful margin. Emma organized the paperwork for all of this. She was at the bank 3 times in a single week, and she prepared the loan documentation with a thoroughness that the bank's loan officer, a careful man named Mr. Haynes, admired so openly that Emma later described the experience as the nicest professional compliment she had received since leaving St. Louis. It was during this period that she and Joel developed the specific version of their relationship that would later seem, looking back, like the particular shape of something that had been inevitable from the beginning, though neither of them would have used that word at the time. They worked together in the evenings at the kitchen table, Joel with his maps and his cattle ledgers and Emma with the documentation and the correspondence, and they talked. Not always about the immediate work, though there was always immediate work to discuss. They talked about larger things, about what it meant to build something lasting in a landscape that was still deciding whether it would sustain human ambition or simply outlast it, about the particular moral weight of the fact that this land had not always been available to build on, about the stories of the Cheyenne and Kiowa people who had been forced from these plains only a few years before, and whose absence Joel spoke about with a directness and an uneasiness that Emma had not expected, and that made her feel again that complicated sensation of encountering someone who was genuinely more than she had initially assumed. He asked her about St. Louis, and she told him. She told him about her father's school and the smell of chalk and autumn leaves that she associated with every good thing about her childhood. She told him about her mother's seamstress work and the particular quality of light in the evenings when her mother sat by the window with her needle, and how that light was different from Kansas light, but that she was beginning to understand the Kansas version of it. She told him about the years after her parents died, not with self-pity, but with the level honesty that their conversations had established as a norm, and he listened with the specific quality of attention that she had come to understand was his version of warmth, present and complete and undistracted. She told him once, late on a Thursday evening when the wind was doing something particularly active outside, and they had been working for several hours, and the conversation had gone somewhere neither of them had quite planned, that she had been afraid she would never find a place that felt like it was meant to have her in it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think about what this house was like before you came here. I think about it quite a lot." Emma looked up from the ledger she was annotating. He was looking at her with the same directness he looked at everything with, but there was something else in it now, something that had been there in smaller quantities for weeks and had apparently decided to stop being small about itself. "Joel," she said, and then did not say anything else because she was not sure what she was going to say. "I know," he said. "I know you have been here 6 weeks, and I know how that is, and I know you came here because you did not have other options, and I would not want you to think I am." He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. "I would not want you to stay here for any reason that was not entirely your own." Emma set down her pen. She looked at him for a long time, and she thought about the auction platform, and the way he had moved through that crowd, and the evening they had stood together under the apple trees without needing to say anything, and the 3 pages of notes she had written on Garrison Ward's document for a man she had known for less than 5 weeks because she cared about whether his ranch survived. And she thought about the fact that she had been asking herself for weeks whether what she felt was gratitude or something else entirely, and had known the answer for at least 3 weeks without letting herself say it out loud. My father used to say, Emma said carefully, that the only honest way to evaluate whether you want to be somewhere is to ask yourself whether you would stay if circumstances no longer required you to. Joel was very still. I would stay, Emma said. That is what I want you to know. The silence that followed was different from all their other silences. It had a particular texture, something warm and slightly breathless, and Joel's expression did something complicated and gentle that she had never seen on him before, and he reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his, once briefly, and then pulled back as though remembering himself. And Emma thought that this was exactly the right pace for this, for a man who was careful about everything he did, and a woman who had learned to be careful about what she trusted. "All right then," Joel said, and his voice was very quiet. "All right." Garrison Ward made his most aggressive move in the 9th week, and it came not through legal mechanisms or financial pressure, but through something that belonged more properly to the dark past of the region than Emma had expected to encounter. He hired 2 men, both with known reputations as enforcement agents in the less legally organized parts of the cattle business, to create an incident designed to discredit Joel with the county authorities and give Ward's consortium grounds to challenge the legitimacy of the Hartwell land title. The incident involved a doctored set of cattle brand records that were deposited with the county registrar, suggesting that 30 head of cattle carrying the Hartwell H brand had in fact been stolen from a ranch in the southern part of the county 2 seasons earlier. It was not a sophisticated fraud, but it did not need to be sophisticated. It only needed to be loud enough and official-looking enough to keep Joel occupied and on the defensive while Ward made his final push to secure the surrounding homestead claims. Emma discovered it by accident. She had gone into Caldwell on a Wednesday to collect supplies and post correspondence, and she stopped into the county registrar's office to file an updated property description that was part of the loan documentation she had been preparing. And the registrar's clerk, a young man named Thomas who was not good at concealing his feelings, was uncomfortable in a way that Emma noted and filed away. She asked to see the current brand registry for the Hartwell spread as part of confirming the property description, which was a routine and entirely legitimate request, and what she found there was not routine. She read the relevant entry twice very carefully, and then she asked Thomas with a calm that she had to work to maintain when this amendment to the registry had been filed. Thomas, who was clearly experiencing significant discomfort with the role he had been put in, told her 2 days ago. Emma was back at the ranch within the hour. She found Joel in the east pasture and told him exactly what she had found and exactly what she believed it meant. Joel listened without interrupting, which she had learned was the way he processed urgency, turning it inward rather than outward, and when she was done, he was quiet for approximately 15 seconds and then he said, "I need to see the original brand records for those 30 head." "I thought you would," Emma said, and produced the documentation she had thought to request copies of from the county registrar before she left. The original registration records, against which the fraudulent amendment could be clearly measured. Joel looked at her over the papers. There was something in his face that was past admiration, something she did not have a precise word for. "How long did you think this out before coming back?" he asked. "On the ride," Emma said. 12 miles is enough time." They were back in Caldwell that afternoon with the original documentation and with Joel's cattle drive records for the relevant season, which established with complete clarity that the 30 head in question had been born on the Hartwell spread and had never left it. Judge Alderman, who by this point had developed a pronounced and visible irritation with anything connected to Garrison Ward's operations in Caldwell County, received them that same afternoon and issued a correction to the brand registry before the close of the business day. Ward was in Caldwell that evening. Emma saw him from the window of the general store and watched him cross the street toward the registrar's office with the specific walk of a man who has just received bad news and has not yet decided how to respond to it. She thought about his hidden motive and his dark past in this county, and the families he had pressured, and the legitimate business he had covered it all with. And she felt a cold, clear anger that she suspected was not entirely unlike what Joel had felt on the day of the auction when he had walked through that crowd and put himself between her and the worst kind of outcome. She thought about that a great deal, actually. The specific thing it meant that someone had done that for her, not because he knew her, not because he owed her anything, simply because it was wrong and he was the kind of person who acted when things were wrong regardless of the personal cost. She thought about it still when she was lying in her room that night with the wind outside and the prairie dark pressing against the window glass. And she understood, with the clarity that comes at night when there is nothing else to distract you from what is most true, that she was entirely and helplessly in love with Joel Hartwell, and had been for quite some time, and that the question of whether this was wise or safe or well-timed was completely irrelevant to the fact of it. Garrison Ward left Caldwell County on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. His consortium's bid for the region effectively collapsed. The combination of Joel's loan arrangement for the neighboring homesteaders, Judge Alderman's increasingly active attention towards business practices, and the very public failure of the fraudulent brand registry scheme had made the whole enterprise untenable. The Eastern investors withdrew their funding, which was the one thing Ward could not compensate for, and he packed his expensive coat and his expensive hat and his catalog of manipulations, and left for Wichita without ceremony. Emma stood on the porch with Joel when they got the news from Billy Crane, who had ridden in from town with the information at a pace that suggested he had found the errand exciting. The morning was clear and cold, the first real cold of what would be an early autumn, and the grass on the hills had turned from gold to a deeper brown, and the apple trees were heavy with fruit in the way they got in September when the harvest was close. "Is it over?" Emma asked. "For now," Joel said. He was looking at the horizon with the expression she now knew well, the one that was turning things over, weighing them. "There will be others like Ward. The consolidation pressure from Eastern capital is not going away. The railroads are changing what cattle country looks like and the big money knows it." "I know," Emma said, "but for now." "For now," he said, and turned to look at her with a directness that had nothing complex about it. "Yes, it's over." She should have gone inside to start the breakfast. The hands would be in from the barn soon, and she had biscuits in the oven and bacon in the pan, and the coffee needed to be checked. She knew all of this. She stayed on the porch. "Emma," Joel said, in the voice he used when he had thought something through completely and was ready to say it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment that stretched and settled. "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, your position here is not conditional on it. I want to be clear about that first because I am aware of the circumstances under which you came here and I would not have you feel—" "Joel," Emma said gently. He stopped. "Just ask," she said. "Would you consider—" He started again. "I would like if you were willing to call on you, properly, with the intention of eventually asking whether you might consider spending your life here, with me." The apple trees caught the morning light. The horses moved in the corral. Somewhere a meadowlark was conducting an argument with the autumn air. Emma thought about the girl who had arrived at the Caldwell station 3 months ago with a carpetbag and a forged contract, and a cold, clear terror that she had refused to show on her face. She thought about the man who had walked through a crowd and said, "Lower that hammer and you will regret it by morning," because it was wrong, and he was incapable of watching something wrong continue when he had the power to stop it. She thought about every evening at the kitchen table, every silence that was better than most people's conversations, every small piece of evidence she had been collecting for 10 weeks of who this man was at his core. "I would consider it," Emma said, "very favorably." Joel's expression did the thing it had been doing in small quantities for months, the thing that was past his normal careful containment, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his, and held it for a moment in the September morning light, and Emma thought that this was the thing she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. This specific combination of safety and substance, and the sense that she was entirely seen. They stood on the porch until the smell of biscuits reached the point where Emma's professional instincts overrode everything else, and she went in to save them from burning. And Joel followed her into the kitchen and sat at the table where they had spent so many evenings, and they looked at each other across it with a kind of helpless and uncomplicated happiness that neither of them had very much practice with. And they were still sitting like that when Billy Crane and the other hands came in for breakfast and pretended not to notice anything different about the morning. Billy noticed. Billy's broad, honest face broke into a grin that he attempted to conceal behind a biscuit and did not succeed at, and Emma caught it and felt warmth move through her chest like the first real warmth of spring. What came after was the careful and genuine courtship of two people who had both been doing things alone for a long time and were learning, incrementally, and with a good deal of patience on both sides, what it meant to let someone else into the interior of their lives. Joel called on her in the formal sense, which in the context of a ranch 12 miles outside of town meant that he knocked on the door of her room on Sunday evenings, and they went for walks along the creek, and he told her things he had not told anyone in years, about his brother in Kansas City with whom he had a complicated grief-shaped relationship, about the 2 seasons he had nearly lost the ranch and the specific terror of that, about the things he wanted that he had stopped letting himself want when the work of survival had taken up all the available space. Emma told him things in return. She told him about the loneliness of the years after her parents died, the particular loneliness of being capable and educated and self-sufficient in a world that did not know what to do with those qualities in a woman, and how that loneliness had been a low, constant noise that she had gotten so accustomed to that she had stopped hearing it until it went quiet here, in this specific place, with this specific person. Joel listened to all of it with the same complete attention he gave everything, and Emma understood gradually that this was not a quality he had developed deliberately, but was simply the way he was made, the same way his honesty was not a performance of virtue, but simply his native mode of operating in the world. And she thought that her father, who had always told her that character was not what people said, but what they defaulted to when no one was watching, would have recognized Joel Hartwell as exactly the kind of person he had spent his life trying to tell her about. She wrote to her cousin in Chicago, a letter several pages long that she had been composing mentally for months. Her cousin, whose name was Adele and who had a sharp and irreverent mind that Emma adored, wrote back with a mixture of joy and the specific brand of protective interrogation that only people who love you very much can deploy. And Emma answered every question with the straightforwardness that had always characterized their correspondence, and received in return a letter that ended with, "You sound entirely yourself again," which was the truest and kindest thing Adele could have said. The proposal, when it came, was in December, on an evening when the first real snow of winter was making the Kansas landscape unrecognizable, and the ranch house was warm and close, and full of the smell of whatever Emma had been cooking since mid-afternoon. Joel had been to Caldwell that day for reasons he had not specified, and he came back with a small package that he set on the kitchen table next to her ledger without comment. Emma looked at the package and looked at him. He was watching her with his arms crossed and his expression doing the particular thing it did when he was nervous, which was become almost excessively still, as though if he moved he would give something away. She opened the package. Inside was a small ring, a simple gold band with a single garnet stone that caught the lamplight and turned warm and red. "It was my mother's," Joel said. "She left it to me specifically. She told me to give it to someone who deserved to have it, which at the time I was 16 and had no idea what that meant. I think I understand now." Emma held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not only the weight of gold and stone, but the weight of what it represented, the leap of faith, the deliberate choosing. "Joel Hartwell," she said, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he said. "Then yes," Emma said. "I am saying yes." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and took her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time. A long kiss that was also a beginning, warm and certain, and entirely free of the hesitation that had characterized every cautious approach that had led to this moment. Because they were both done being cautious now, both done calculating risk, both simply here. They were married in March of 1880, in the spring when the prairie grass was coming back green after the winter, and the apple trees were beginning to show buds. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell church with approximately 50 guests, which was more people than either of them had intended, and was entirely the result of Mrs. Caldwell's organizational enthusiasm and Billy Crane's inability to keep a secret. Judge Alderman attended. Mr. Haynes from the bank attended. A surprising number of the homesteading families Joel had helped the previous fall attended, and the reception in the churchyard afterward went on for several hours in the pale March sunlight, and was one of those events that people in the county talked about afterward as exactly the kind of thing that made a community feel like a community. Emma's cousin Adele came from Chicago on the train, arriving 2 days before the wedding, and spending those 2 days in a state of barely contained observation that culminated in a quiet conversation with Emma on the evening before the ceremony in which Adele said, "He is exactly as you described, and I was prepared not to believe you." And Emma had laughed for the first time in weeks in the deep, easy way she had forgotten she knew how to laugh. Joel's brother Daniel came from Kansas City, which surprised Emma and, she thought, surprised Joel as well, though Joel was careful not to show it. Daniel was 2 years younger and looked enough like Joel to be immediately identifiable as his brother, but had a quality of unease about him, a restlessness, that suggested someone who had been trying on different versions of himself and had not yet settled on one that fit. He and Joel had a conversation alone on the morning of the wedding that Emma did not hear and did not ask about. And when Joel came back from it, his expression was the one she had learned to associate with things he was working through that had old roots. But he was also, she thought, slightly lighter, as though something that had been closed for a long time had been opened a little. After the wedding, after the reception, after Adele's train back to Chicago, and Daniel's return to Kansas City, and the last of the guests had gone home, Emma and Joel were alone on the porch of the ranch house in the early spring evening, and the prairie was doing the thing it did in spring evenings, when the light turned amber and the air had a quality of possibility in it that was different from every other season. Emma was wearing her wedding ring alongside her mother's garnet ring, which she had worn every day since December on a chain around her neck, and had moved to her finger that morning. Joel had his arm around her and she was leaning against him in a way that felt like something she had always known how to do. "What are you thinking about?" Joel asked. "Everything," Emma said honestly. "I am thinking about where I was a year ago, and about Howard Briggs standing in that auction yard, and about the look on Clyde Perkins' face when you told him to put the hammer down. I am thinking about my father, who would have liked you very much. I am thinking about the fact that I came out here on a train with $4 and a forged contract and ended up with," she gestured at the landscape, the barns, the apple trees, the evening. "This." Joel was quiet for a moment. "You ended up with all of this because of who you are," he said. "Not because of luck or circumstance. You could read Garrison Ward's contract in 20 minutes and pick out the provisions that mattered. You could copy those brand registry documents before anyone thought to stop you. You could run a household account and manage the loan documentation, and do all of it without being asked because you understood what needed doing and you did it. You are the one who walked through a crowd to stop an auction," Emma said. "Anyone would have done that." "No," Emma said clearly. "They would not have. I was there. 200 people were there and one of them did something." Joel was quiet again. She could feel the acknowledgement in his silence. "We are good together," Emma said. "That is what I am thinking about most of all, that we are very good together." "We are," Joel said, and pulled her slightly closer, and they watched the spring evening move across the Kansas sky until the stars came out. The first year of their marriage was the year they learned each other in the way that proximity and shared difficulty and shared joy teaches two people, in the layered and surprising and sometimes humbling manner that no courtship, however attentive, can fully prepare you for. Emma learned that Joel had a specific stubbornness about admitting when he was physically exhausted, a holdover from years of being the only person holding the ranch together, and she developed a set of strategies for getting around it that involved neither confrontation nor subtlety, but simply the application of food and quiet, and the removal of the expectation that he needed to keep working. Joel learned that Emma, who was composed under almost every form of external pressure, had a very low tolerance for willful ignorance, and had the capacity to deliver a correction with a gentleness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. They disagreed, occasionally and productively, about the accounts and about the handling of the hands, and about the question of whether to expand the herd in the south pasture. They agreed, completely and without negotiation required, about the schoolhouse Joel had built and the importance of maintaining it, about the terms on which they would deal with their neighbors, about the particular moral weight of the land they lived on and what they owed to it, and to the people who had lived on it before them. Emma wrote to Judge Alderman in the spring of 1880 with a proposal she had been developing through the winter. The proposal was for a formal county registry of labor contracts for domestic workers coming from outside the region, a mechanism that would require independent legal review of any contract before it could be enforced, with the specific goal of preventing the kind of fraud Howard Briggs had perpetrated from occurring again. Alderman received the proposal with interest and invited Emma and Joel to his ranch to discuss it, and the conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and resulted in a formal proposal that Alderman submitted to the county commission in June. It passed in September, which was also the month that Emma discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Joel on a September evening, at the kitchen table where so much of their life together had been conducted, and his face did something she had never seen it do, something completely open and unguarded and slightly stunned in the best possible way. He stood up and came around the table and held her, and she felt him breathe, and she thought that this was the full version of the happiness she had glimpsed on the morning they had stood under the apple trees and told each other things that mattered. Their son was born in April of 1881, a healthy, loud, and emphatic child whom they named Thomas after Emma's father, which made something in Emma settle into its final right position in a way she had not expected. Thomas Hartwell had his father's dark eyes and his mother's resolute expression, and he came into the world with the air of someone who intended to make himself known, which Billy Crane pointed out was entirely appropriate given his parentage. The Hartwell spread in the spring of 1881 was a different entity from the one Emma had arrived at nearly 2 years earlier. The accounts were organized and healthy. The herd had expanded by a careful margin. The neighboring homesteaders were stable, the loan arrangement having worked as Emma and Joel had hoped, and 2 of the families had begun to make real improvements to their claims that would carry them through the next difficult season with better resources. The brand registry fraud system that Briggs had used was no longer operationally available in Caldwell County, which was not a small thing. Daniel Hartwell came back from Kansas City for Thomas's birth and stayed for a month, which was longer than anyone had expected, including Daniel himself. He and Joel repaired something between them that Emma did not know the full history of, but recognized as old and significant, in the way that things are when 2 people grew up alongside each other carrying more weight than children should have to carry. She liked Daniel. He was not like his brother in temperament, but he had the same fundamental honesty at his core, just more disorganized about it, and she thought that given time and the right circumstances he would become someone his own history had not yet allowed him to be. On the day Daniel left for Kansas City, he stood on the porch with his bag and looked at the ranch and then at Joel and said, "Father would be glad of this. All of it." And Joel nodded once, and that was all that needed to be said about that. In the summer of 1881, Garrison Ward resurfaced, not in Caldwell County but in a neighboring county to the west, where he was running an identical scheme with different particulars and a new set of investors. Emma read about it in the Caldwell newspaper, which had recently expanded to twice-weekly publication. She cut out the article and put it on Joel's desk without comment. Joel read it, thought about it, and wrote a letter to the county sheriff in the neighboring county, a 3-page letter that detailed precisely what Ward had done in Caldwell County, how it had been stopped, and what mechanisms had been put in place to prevent recurrence. He enclosed copies of the relevant legal documentation, the court orders, the fraudulent contract, the brand registry correction, and the labor contract registry legislation. He did not ask Emma whether he should send it. She had been the one who put the article on his desk. The following spring, Emma received a letter from the sheriff of that neighboring county thanking Joel for the information and reporting that Garrison Ward had been arrested and was facing charges in 3 counties. Emma read the letter and thought about the shape of justice, which was not always swift or dramatic, but was sometimes, if people were stubborn enough and organized enough and willing to do the quiet work of documentation and correspondence, a real thing. Thomas learned to walk that spring, which was a development that the entire ranch took an enormous interest in, and in particular Billy Crane, who had appointed himself Thomas's unofficial guardian with a seriousness that Emma found both touching and slightly overwhelming. Thomas was an emphatic walker, which surprised no one, and he became a regular presence in the kitchen and on the porch and in the yard, examining everything with the focused curiosity that Emma recognized as her own operating mode in a younger and more mobile package. Joel taught him the names of the horses. Emma taught him the names of the stars. These 2 things seemed, to both of them, like exactly the right division. The labor contract registry legislation that Emma had proposed, and Judge Alderman had shepherded through the county commission began, in the 2nd and 3rd years of its operation, to demonstrate results that neither of them had been entirely certain about when they proposed it. 2 cases were filed under its provisions in 1882, both involving labor contractors using fraudulent terms that the registry review process identified before anyone was harmed. In both cases, the contractors were charged and the workers were protected. Judge Alderman wrote Emma a letter in which he said, without any of the formal hedging typical of official correspondence, that this had been a good idea and she should be proud of it. Emma kept the letter in the same box where she kept her father's last letter to her, and the first letter Joel had written her from the ranch, confirming the terms of her employment in his careful, precise handwriting. She discovered she was expecting again in the fall of 1882, and this time she told Joel while they were out by the apple trees, because the harvest was on, and the orchard was full of that particular September light, and it seemed like the right place. Joel's response this time was less stunned and more immediately joyful, a quality of unguarded happiness she had now seen enough times to trust completely. He pulled her close and held her, and they stood in the orchard with apples falling around them in the morning wind, and Emma thought about the woman who had stood on an auction platform 3 years ago with nothing but a carpetbag and her own intelligence, and the refusal to accept that this was how her life would go. Their daughter was born in May of 1883, and they named her Ruth, after no one in particular, but because it was a name that meant something to both of them, a name about loyalty and choosing to stay. Ruth Hartwell had her mother's steady gray eyes and her father's broad-shouldered stubbornness, and she made her opinions known at full volume from the first day, which Billy Crane said was also appropriate. And Thomas, at 2 years old, was uncertain about the new development for approximately 4 days, and then became devoted to his sister with a protectiveness that was frankly remarkable in a 2-year-old, and that Joel observed with an expression Emma did not need to translate. The ranch in 1883 was thriving. The accounts showed 3 consecutive years of positive return after the difficult years of the late 1870s. The herd was healthy and well managed. The hands were stable, the same core group with some additions, including Daniel Hartwell, who had returned from Kansas City in the spring of 1883, not for a visit but permanently, having apparently reached the conclusion that the life he had been trying to build in the city was not the one that suited him. He was a good hand and a better person than he had been when Emma first met him, and Joel's quiet relief at having his brother back was something Emma observed privately and did not remark on. The homesteaders in the surrounding county were stable, and several had prospered. The schoolhouse Joel had built was now officially a county school with a teacher funded by the county education board, a small victory that Emma considered significant out of proportion to its size, because she understood what education meant to the families whose children attended it. Caldwell County was not paradise. It was Kansas in the Gilded Age, a place of genuine beauty and genuine difficulty, of opportunity that was not equally distributed and injustice that persisted alongside real progress, of wide skies and hard labor, and people building things in circumstances that did not always cooperate. Emma was clear-eyed about all of this. She had never been someone who confused where she was with what she wished it was. But it was also a place where she had a purpose and a home and a community, and a man who was the most consistently honest and genuinely good person she had ever known, and 2 children who were growing into themselves with the specific combination of their parents' qualities that kept surprising her, and work that was real and consequential and entirely hers. She stood on the porch on a late summer evening in 1883, with Thomas playing in the yard and Ruth asleep in the house, and Joel coming in from the south pasture on his horse with the long shadow of late afternoon ahead of him, and the apple trees visible at the corner of the house, and the prairie running out to the horizon under a sky that was doing something magnificent with the last of the light. And she thought about Caldwell, Kansas, and the auction platform, and the hammer that had never come down. She thought about what her life had been made of and what it was made of now, and the specific shape of the distance between those 2 things, which was not luck or rescue or circumstance, but was the accumulated weight of 2 people making deliberate choices daily, to be honest and brave and present, and to build something that was worth more than either of them could have constructed alone. Joel reached the gate and dismounted and came through it, and Thomas ran to him with the particular full-body enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to restrain the expression of joy, and Joel swung the boy up onto his shoulders in a single fluid motion and walked toward the porch with Thomas crowing with delight above him. He looked up at Emma as he reached the steps. "Good evening," he said, which was what he always said when he came home because he was a man of settled habits and she had come to love every one of them. "Good evening," Emma said. "Ruth has been asleep for an hour. Dinner is almost ready. And I have been thinking about writing another letter to Judge Alderman." Joel raised his eyebrows slightly. "What about this time?" "The apprenticeship terms for women entering skilled trades," Emma said. "I have been looking at the county records and the numbers are not good. Women are being brought into apprenticeships under terms that are exploitative," Joel said. "Exactly." He climbed the porch steps and came to stand beside her, Thomas still on his shoulders, his son's small hands fisted in his hair for balance, and the evening light doing its particular best with the Kansas sky above them. "Write the letter," Joel said. "I intend to," Emma said. He put his arm around her carefully, because of Thomas and the architectural engineering involved, and Emma leaned into him and looked out at the prairie and the apple trees, and the life they had made here from the wreckage of a forged contract and a public auction, and a man who had decided, on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1879, that some things were simply not going to continue on his watch. The wind moved through the grass. Thomas informed his father from his elevated position that he wanted to learn to ride his own horse. Ruth stirred inside and made a sound that suggested her hour of sleep had been quite enough for her purposes. Emma went inside to check on her daughter and finish dinner, and Joel followed her in, their son still riding on his shoulders, and the door closed behind them on the warm and lamplit interior of a home that had been built the slow, honest way, out of character and labor, and the specific kind of love that does not arrive fully formed but is made daily, in the deliberate choices two people make toward each other. Outside, the prairie evening continued its business, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful, and the Hartwell ranch sat in the middle of it like something that had found its exact right place, the lights in the windows a warm and certain signal in the dark. It was exactly where they were supposed to be, and they were staying.